Footsteps echoed on the damp concrete, followed by the cold metallic click of a revolver. A kidnapped girl, shivering and bruised on the warehouse floor, begged for her life, bracing for the final blow. But when the ruthless mafia boss stepped out of the shadows and finally saw her face, the execution stopped dead. His eyes went wide, his jaw clenched, and he unleashed a roar that shook the walls. "Kill everyone who touched her. Let me tell you the true story." The rain in Manhattan that Tuesday night felt more like ice than water slicking the pavement of the Upper East Side in a glossy, unforgiving sheen. Juliet Hayes pulled her wool trench coat tighter around her slender frame, her boots clicking rhythmically against the concrete as she hurried down 72nd Street. At 26, Juliet lived a quiet, meticulously ordered life. As a junior conservator at Sotheby's, her days were spent breathing life back into forgotten masterpieces, gently swabbing away decades of grime from minor Monets and obscure Renaissance portraits. She dealt in preservation, in delicate touches, and in silence. She had no idea that her world was about to collide with one of brutal, unyielding violence. It was 10:14 p.m. Juliet had stayed late at the auction house, entirely absorbed in restoring a tear in a 19th century canvas. Exhausted, but satisfied, she was making her usual trek toward the Lexington Avenue subway station. The street was largely deserted, the ambient glow of the street lamps reflecting in the puddles. She paused near the corner of Park Avenue to adjust the strap of her leather tote bag, her mind already drifting to the leftover Thai food waiting in her modest Astoria apartment. That was the exact moment the black Cadillac Escalade violently mounted the curb, its tires screaming against the wet asphalt. Before Juliet could even register the massive vehicle blocking her path, the sliding door was thrown open. Two figures entirely clad in black erupted from the back seat. The first man, massive and built like a cinder block, grabbed her by the shoulders. The second man, shorter but terrifyingly quick, clamped a heavy-gloved hand over her mouth, stifling the scream that was tearing its way up her throat. "Don't make a sound, Katerina! Not one word!" The shorter man hissed his breath, hot and smelling sharply of stale Marlboros and peppermint gum. Juliet thrashed violently, her heavy tote bag swinging and connecting with the larger man's knee, but it was like hitting a brick wall. Panic, sharp and blinding, exploded in her chest. Katerina, who the hell was Katerina? She tried to speak to, yell that they had the wrong person, but the gloved hand was crushing her lips against her teeth, drawing the coppery taste of blood. In a matter of seconds, she was lifted off the ground and hurled into the cavernous, dark interior of the Escalade. She hit the floorboards hard, the breath knocking out of her lungs. Before she could scramble up, heavy zip ties were viciously secured around her wrists, the plastic biting deep into her delicate skin. A thick, coarse canvas bag was yanked over her head, plunging her into total darkness. "Go, go, go, drive!" the larger man barked. The SUV's engine roared, and Juliet felt the intense G-force as the vehicle sped away, leaving her normal life vanishing in the rearview mirror. "You're making a mistake," Juliet finally managed to scream through the canvas bag, her voice muffled and trembling. "I'm not Katerina. My name is Juliet. I work at an auction house. I have maybe $3,000 in my Chase account. Take my wallet. Just let me go." Laughter echoed in the dark cabin, harsh, cruel, and completely devoid of empathy. "Nice try, princess." The shorter man, who Juliet would later learn was named Tommy, chuckled. "Your old man really thought he could hide you out in plain sight, having you walk out of St. Ambroeus every Tuesday night, wearing that designer coat. The boss has been tracking the Volkov family for months. You're our golden ticket." Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Volkov. The name sounded Russian. She had just bought a coffee at St. Ambroeus before heading back to the office. She was wearing a vintage Burberry trench coat, she had bought at a thrift store in Brooklyn. It was a catastrophic, unimaginable case of mistaken identity. "Please," she sobbed, the reality of the situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. The zip ties were cutting off her circulation, her hands already going numb. "You have to check my ID. It's in my bag. I swear to God, look at my ID. Shut up!" The larger man, Victor, growled. His heavy boot pressed down sharply against her thigh, pinning her to the floorboards. "One more word and I'll break your jaw. The ghost wants you alive, but he didn't say you had to be pretty." The ghost. The moniker sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her veins. Even civilians in New York had heard whispers of the man they called the Ghost of New York. He was the head of the Castiglione crime family, a phantom who had ruthlessly conquered the city's underworld over the past 5 years. He was a myth, a monster, who dealt in absolutes, completely annihilating his enemies and leaving no trace behind. And now these men thought she was the daughter of his Russian rival. The drive felt like an eternity. Juliet lay in the dark, every bump in the road sending jolts of pain through her bound arms. She prayed silently, desperately, trying to map their route by the sounds of the city. The smooth hum of the highway gave way to rougher roads, the distant sound of foghorns indicating they were near the water. The smell of the air changing, bleeding from city exhaust into something fouler brine, rotting garbage and iron. Finally, the Escalade lurched to a halt. The heavy doors slid open, and the freezing November air washed over her. Rough hands grabbed her arms, dragging her out of the vehicle. Her boots scraped against gravel, and she tripped her knees, hitting the hard ground, tearing her tights and scraping her skin. "Get up!" Victor snarled, yanking her upright by her hair. Juliet cried out in pain, hot tears soaking the coarse fabric of the hood, covering her face. She was utterly powerless, dragged forward into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The heavy metal doors screeched open, protesting loudly on rusted hinges. Juliet was shoved forward, stumbling blindly over a raised concrete threshold. The air inside was completely different. It was freezing, an industrial chill that seeped instantly through her wool coat and settled deep into her bones. The unmistakable metallic stench of old blood and ammonia assaulted her senses. "Where are we?" she whimpered, her teeth beginning to chatter. "Welcome to Hunts Point, Princess." Tommy replied, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. End of the line for the Volkov Empire. They forced her to her knees on what felt like a grated metal floor. Juliet could hear the dripping of water, echoing somewhere in the distance, a hollow rhythmic sound that only amplified her terror. Suddenly the canvas bag was ripped from her head. Juliet gasped, blinking rapidly against the harsh, unforgiving glare of industrial halogen lights. As her eyes adjusted, her worst fears were realized. They were in an abandoned meatpacking facility. Enormous rusted iron hooks hung motionless from tracks on the high ceiling. The concrete walls were stained with years of grime and dark, unidentifiable splotches. There were no windows, no exits visible from where she knelt. Victor stood over her, a hulking mass of muscle in a cheap leather jacket, a smug grin plastered across his scarred face. Tommy was leaning against a metal table nearby, casually checking the cylinder of a heavy silver revolver. "Look at her shaking," Victor sneered, crossing his massive arms. "The great Bratva princess. Doesn't look so tough without her father's bodyguards around, does she?" "I keep telling you," Juliet cried, desperation making her voice crack. She looked up at Victor, her green eyes wide and pleading. "Look at my face, I'm not Russian. My name is Juliet Hayes. I have a driver's license in my bag. I have an ID badge for Sotheby's. Please just look." Victor's expression darkened. He stepped forward, his heavy boot echoing off the metal grate. Without warning, he backhanded her across the face. The force of the blow snapped Juliet's head to the side. Pain exploded across her cheekbone, sharp and blinding. She collapsed onto her side, her bound hands unable to break her fall. The metallic taste of fresh blood flooded her mouth, her lower lip split open and throbbing violently. "I told you to shut up!" Victor roared, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "You think we're stupid. You think you can lie your way out of this. Your father took out 3 of our guys in Brighton Beach last week. The boss is coming to handle you personally. You're bait, Katerina. And when Volkov comes for you, we're going to slaughter him right here." Juliet lay on the freezing grate, hot tears streaming down her face, stinging the fresh cut on her cheek. She was going to die here. The realization settled over her with a crushing, suffocating weight. The ghost of New York was coming, a mafia kingpin known for his absolute ruthlessness. Once he arrived, he would see she wasn't the Volkov girl, but it wouldn't matter. She had seen the faces of his men. She knew the location of one of their safe houses. She was a liability, and men like him didn't leave loose ends. "Boss is 5 minutes out," Tommy announced, looking at a burner phone in his hand. He holstered his revolver and straightened his jacket. "Make her look presentable. He likes his prizes looking at him when he talks." Victor grabbed Juliet by the collar of her coat, dragging her back up to her knees. She was dizzy, her vision swimming slightly from the strike. Blood dripped slowly from her chin, staining the beige lapel of her trench coat. She didn't fight back this time. The fight had been literally beaten out of her. She just kneeled there, shivering uncontrollably, waiting for the end. The silence in the warehouse became deafening, broken only by Juliet's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. Then the sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel outside shattered the quiet. Not just one vehicle, but several. The deep, guttural rumble of high-end engines. "Open the bay doors," Victor ordered, suddenly looking nervous. He smoothed down his hair, his posture straightening. The arrogant thug from 10 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a subordinate, terrified of his superior. The massive corrugated metal doors began to roll upward on motorized tracks, revealing the pitch-black night outside. 3 matte-black Mercedes G-Wagons were parked in a tight formation, their bright LED headlights piercing the gloom of the warehouse and casting long, monstrous shadows across the floor. The doors of the vehicles opened in perfect unison. A dozen men poured out, stepping into the warehouse. They didn't look like street thugs. They wore immaculate dark suits beneath long cashmere overcoats, moving with terrifying silent precision. They carried themselves with the lethal grace of apex predators, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the warehouse without a single word spoken. Juliet squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing shallow. "This is it," she thought. "This is how my life ends. Over a stupid vintage coat." Then the rear door of the center G-Wagon opened. The atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted by 10 degrees. The air grew impossibly thick, heavy, with an oppressive, undeniable aura of absolute power. Footsteps slow and deliberate echoed on the concrete. The men in suits parted like the Red Sea, lowering their heads in deep, instinctual deference. The ghost of New York had arrived. Dominic Castiglione stepped into the harsh glare of the halogen lights. He was a terrifyingly beautiful man, tall and broad-shouldered, radiating an aura of lethal, predatory calm. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that fit his athletic frame flawlessly, an onyx black silk tie resting against a crisp white shirt. A platinum Rolex Daytona glinted on his left wrist. His dark hair was perfectly styled, but it was his eyes that commanded the room, a striking icy blue that seemed to strip away all pretense and look directly into a person's soul. He carried no visible weapon, yet he was undeniably the most dangerous thing in the room. "Boss," Victor said, his voice trembling slightly. He bowed his head. "We secured the package. Grabbed her right off 72nd Street exactly like the intel said. She put up a fight, tried to lie about who she was, but we handled her. Dominic didn't look at Victor. He didn't look at Tommy. His icy gaze swept across the room, taking in the rust, the bloodstains, the absolute filth of the slaughterhouse, before his eyes finally settled on the small, shivering figure kneeling on the floor. Juliet was looking down her chin, pressed to her chest, her dark hair falling forward to obscure her face. She was trembling so violently that her teeth clicked together. Dominic's jaw tightened. He despised messy work. He was a man of strategy, of surgical strikes. Kidnapping the Volkov girl was a necessary evil to draw the Russian boss out of his fortress, but he took no pleasure in terrified women. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, his movements slow and fluid, and walked toward her. Every footstep rang out like a judge's gavel in the silent warehouse. He stopped mere inches from Juliet. He could see the cheap zip ties biting into her pale wrists, leaving angry red welts. He could see the drops of fresh blood staining the collar of her coat. A dark, dangerous anger began to simmer in Dominic's chest. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice was deep, smooth, and laced with an unquestionable authority. It wasn't a shout, it was a decree. Juliet didn't move. She was too terrified. "Look. At me." Slowly, agonizingly, Juliet raised her head. The harsh overhead light hit her face, illuminating the swelling purple bruise blooming across her left cheekbone, the split, bloody lip, and the absolute heart-shattering terror in her wide green eyes. Dominic Castiglione froze. The air vanished from his lungs. The entire world, the warehouse, his men, the Mafia war, it all evaporated into absolute nothingness. For the first time in 10 years, the legendary, unflinching ghost of New York felt his heart literally skip a beat. He knew those eyes. He knew that face. It hit him like a physical blow, a sudden, violent flashback to a freezing night in December, exactly 5 years ago. He had been 25, a rising captain in his father's syndicate, ambushed by a rival crew in Hell's Kitchen. He had taken 2 9mm hollow points to the side, bleeding out in a dark, garbage-filled alley. He was dying. He knew he was dying. Then an angel had appeared. A young woman, exhausted and wearing nursing scrubs, taking a shortcut home. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. Despite his blood, despite the obvious danger, she had dragged his massive, fading body up 3 flights of stairs into her tiny, cramped apartment. She had locked the door, ripped off his shirt, and spent the next 6 hours painstakingly stitching his wounds, saving his life, with hands that trembled, but never stopped working. He had passed out on her cheap sofa. When he woke up, his men had found him and extracted him before he could even get her name. For 5 years, Dominic had turned the city upside down, looking for the girl with the kind green eyes who had saved a monster without asking for a dime. She had vanished, moved out the very next day, frightened by the men who had come for him. And now here she was, the only pure thing he had ever encountered in his dark, blood-soaked life, kneeling on a filthy slaughterhouse floor, tied up like an animal, bleeding because of his men. The silence stretched, turning thick and suffocating. The men in the room exchanged confused, nervous glances. Dominic stood paralyzed, his icy blue eyes fixed on Juliet's bruised face. Juliet stared back, her breath catching. Through the haze of pain and terror, a flicker of recognition sparked in her mind. The sharp jawline, the intense blue eyes. It couldn't be. The bleeding man from the alley. The man she had thought about 1,000 times over the years. "You," Juliet whispered, her voice barely audible. The sound of her voice snapped the trance. Dominic's shock instantly transmuted into something terrifying. The cold, calculating boss vanished. What replaced him was a force of pure, apocalyptic rage. The temperature in the room seemed to drop below zero. Dominic slowly turned his head to look at Victor. The big man swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that he had made a colossal, fatal error, though he had no idea what it was. "Who did this?" Dominic asked. His voice wasn't a roar yet. It was a deadly vibrating whisper that carried to every corner of the warehouse. Victor puffed out his chest, completely misreading the situation. "She was fighting Boss. She wouldn't stop screaming, so I had to discipline her. Show her who's in charge. You know how these Bratva girls." Victor never finished his sentence. Dominic moved faster than humanly possible. He closed the distance between them in a split second, grabbing Victor by the throat with one hand and slamming the massive man backward against the heavy metal table. The sound of Victor's skull bouncing off the steel echoed loudly. "Boss, wait!" Tommy yelled, reaching instinctively for his revolver. It was a fatal mistake. Before Tommy's gun even cleared its holster, two of Dominic's personal guards, Enzo and Matteo, drew their suppressed weapons and fired. Two quiet thwips cut through the air. Tommy dropped to the floor instantly, dead before his knees hit the grate. Juliet screamed, squeezing her eyes shut and curling into a ball. Victor was choking his hands, desperately tearing at Dominic's iron grip on his throat. Dominic leaned in close his face, a mask of absolute unhinged fury. "You put your filthy hands on her," Dominic snarled, his voice dropping into a demonic register. "You hit her." "I didn't. No." Victor gurgled, his face turning blue. Dominic's eyes blazed with a murderous fire. He dropped Victor, letting the man crash to the floor, gasping for air. Dominic turned his back on him, looking at Enzo. The ghost of New York stood amidst the blood and the rust, his chest heaving his immaculate suit, ruined by the dust of the struggle. He pointed a finger at the gasping Victor on the floor and unleashed a roar that shook the very foundation of the warehouse, a sound born of 10 years of searching and a second of pure horror. "Kill everyone who touched her." Without a moment of hesitation, Enzo stepped forward, raised his weapon, and put a single bullet between Victor's eyes. The massive thug went limp. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profound. Dominic ignored the bodies. He immediately dropped to his knees in front of Juliet, the fine wool of his trousers soaking up the dirty water on the grate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek silver switchblade, and carefully, with hands that were completely steady, cut the thick zip ties from her wrists. Juliet gasped as the blood rushed back into her hands. She collapsed forward, but she didn't hit the floor. Dominic caught her. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, tightly burying his face in her dark hair. He smelled of expensive cologne rain and danger. Without a word, he unbuttoned his heavy Loro Piana overcoat and draped it over her shivering shoulders, cocooning her in warmth. "I've got you," Dominic whispered, his voice suddenly incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the monster who had just ordered 2 men dead. He scooped her up into his arms, rising to his feet effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing. "You're safe now, Piccola. I swear to God, no one will ever touch you again." The ride away from Hunts Point was a blur of flashing city lights and absolute suffocating silence. Juliet sat in the cavernous back seat of the Mercedes G-Wagon, enveloped in the heavy warmth of Dominic's cashmere overcoat. The lingering scent of his expensive cedarwood and black pepper cologne did little to mask the coppery tang of her own blood. She stared blankly at the tinted window, her mind utterly fractured. Less than an hour ago, she had been a junior art conservator, agonizing over a torn canvas. Now she was flanked by the most dangerous men in New York, speeding away from a slaughterhouse where 2 men had been executed right in front of her. Dominic sat beside her, rigid and unmoving, a dark silhouette against the passing street lamps. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sheer gravity of his presence commanded the space, keeping his heavily armed guards, Enzo and Matteo, staring straight ahead, their hands resting near their holsters. "Where are you taking me?" Juliet finally whispered, her voice rasping painfully in her throat. Her split lip throbbed with every syllable. Dominic turned his head, his icy blue eyes instantly softening as they swept over her bruised face. The transformation was jarring, the ruthless killer evaporating to reveal a man harboring a terrifyingly deep devotion. "Somewhere safe, somewhere no one will ever find you." They bypassed Juliet's modest Astoria neighborhood, entirely speeding over the bridge into the glittering heart of Manhattan. The motorcade descended into a subterranean parking garage beneath a sleek, monolithic skyscraper in Tribeca. They bypassed the lobby, taking a private, biometric-secured elevator that shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. When the polished steel doors slid open, Juliet gasped. The penthouse spanned the entire top floor, a sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree panoramic view of the New York skyline, the city spread out below them like a glittering carpet of diamonds. The floors were imported black marble, the furniture a blend of dark leather and brushed steel. It was breathtakingly beautiful, cold, and utterly impenetrable. It was a fortress in the sky. "Dr. Rossi is on his way," Dominic announced, gently guiding Juliet by the elbow toward a massive, sunken living room. He refused to let Enzo or Matteo come within 10 feet of her. "Sit. Don't try to talk." Within 15 minutes, an older man with a weathered face and a battered leather medical bag arrived. Dr. Rossi asked no questions. He didn't flinch at the blood on Juliet's face or the bruised ring around her wrists from the zip ties. In the Castiglione, family silence was the highest currency. He expertly cleaned and stitched Juliet's lip, applied a soothing medical-grade arnica salve to her swollen cheekbone, and bandaged her chafed wrists. "She needs rest, Dominic," the doctor murmured, packing his tools. "And ice for that cheek. The shock will set in soon. Keep her warm." Once the doctor and the guards had retreated to the outer corridors, Dominic walked over to the expansive wet bar. He poured a generous measure of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler and walked back to Juliet, handing it to her. "Drink," he commanded softly. "It will help with the adrenaline crash." Juliet took the glass with trembling hands, the crystal clinking against her teeth as she swallowed the burning scotch. She coughed, wrapping her arms around herself. She looked up at the man standing over her. Without the shadows of the warehouse, he was devastatingly handsome, but the danger radiating from him was palpable. 5 years, Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in her chest. He stepped closer, staring down at her. "For 5 years I turned this city upside down, looking for the girl with the green eyes who stitched me up in Hell's Kitchen. You vanished. You moved out of that apartment the very next morning. Your men," Juliet whispered, her voice shaking. "They came back. They were carrying guns. They were covered in blood. I was terrified. I thought they were coming to silence me. So I packed a bag and left. I never told anyone what happened." Dominic's jaw clenched tightly. "They were looking for you to protect you, to bring you to me so I could thank you. I owe you my life, Juliet." He knew her name. Of course he did. His men had rummaged through her tote bag before they tossed her in the SUV. "You don't owe me anything," she pleaded, panic rising in her chest again as the reality of her situation settled in. "Please, I just want to go home. I have a cat. I have work tomorrow at Sotheby's. I promise I won't tell the police anything about what happened tonight. Just let me leave." Dominic slowly knelt in front of her, uncaring that his $1,000 suit trousers brushed against the marble floor. He reached out his large, calloused hands, hovering just an inch from her face, wanting to touch her, but terrified of hurting her further. "You can't go home, Juliet," he said, his tone uncompromisingly firm. "My men made a catastrophic mistake. They thought you were Katerina Volkov. The Russian Bratva knows you were taken by my crew. If I let you walk out of that door, Alexei Volkov's men will snatch you off the street before sunrise. They will torture you just to send a message to me, and then they will kill you." Juliet's breath hitched. "But I'm not her when they see I'm not Russian." "It doesn't matter." Dominic's voice flared a sudden flash of the monster, returning before he forcefully reined it in. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "In this world, perception is reality. They think I care about the girl my men kidnapped. And they are right. Because the girl my men kidnapped is the only breathing soul in this world I would burn down the city to protect." He finally closed the distance, gently resting his thumbs against her unbruised jawline. His touch was shockingly warm, incredibly reverent. "You are staying here," Dominic stated an ironclad vow. "No one gets through my doors. No one touches you. You saved my life in the dark, Juliet. Now, I am going to save yours." For 3 days, Juliet lived inside the gilded cage. Dominic's penthouse was a masterpiece of luxury, yet every inch of it screamed of isolation. The elevators required biometric scans to operate. Heavily armed guards in tailored suits stood silent vigil at the end of the hallways. Her phone had been confiscated. Dominic claimed it could be tracked by Volkov's hackers, and her connection to the outside world was severed. She spent her time wandering the massive library, running her fingers over first-edition classics, trying to ignore the creeping sense of Stockholm Syndrome. Dominic treated her like absolute royalty. He had his personal chef prepare her favorite Thai dishes. He had a private shopper deliver racks of designer silk loungewear and cashmere sweaters to replace her bloodied clothes. He never forced her to talk, never pushed her boundaries, and looked at her with a terrifying, consuming intensity that made her heart race for reasons completely, entirely separate from fear. But the ghost couldn't hide the monster forever. On the 4th night, the war spilled onto the streets of New York. Juliet was sitting on the velvet sofa, reading a book on Renaissance art restoration, when the massive, flat-screen television in the background broke into an emergency news broadcast. A massive warehouse in Brighton Beach was engulfed in towering flames. Fire trucks surrounded the perimeter, but the anchor's voice was grim. Authorities suspect arson in what appears to be a coordinated attack on properties owned by Russian oligarch Alexei Volkov. Juliet dropped her book. Her blood ran cold. The front doors of the penthouse burst open. Dominic strode in, moving like a hurricane. He was flanked by Enzo and a new man, Lorenzo, his elegantly dressed, sharp-eyed underboss. Dominic had stripped off his suit jacket. His white dress shirt rolled up to the elbows. His knuckles were split and bleeding, and the heavy scent of smoke and gunpowder clung to him like a dark halo. "They hit the shipping containers in Red Hook," Lorenzo was arguing, pacing behind Dominic. "Volkov is sending a message. He thinks we're holding his daughter hostage. We need to release a statement to the 5 families. Tell them it was a botched grab, and we don't have Katerina." "I don't explain myself to anyone," Dominic snarled, pouring a drink and downing it in one brutal swallow. "Volkov stepped onto my turf. He shot up my club in Queens. I'm going to rip his empire apart, brick by brick." "Dominic, you're starting a full-scale war over a misunderstanding," Lorenzo yelled, throwing his hands up in frustration. "The commission won't back you, all because of this civilian—" Lorenzo shot a venomous glare toward the living room, spotting Juliet on the sofa. Dominic moved so fast it was a blur. He grabbed Lorenzo by the lapels of his suit and slammed him against the marble pillar of the kitchen island. The crystal decanters rattled violently. "Watch your mouth, Lorenzo." Dominic whispered, his voice a lethal, vibrating threat that made the hairs on Juliet's arms stand up. "You speak of her with respect, or I will cut your tongue out of your head and feed it to the dogs. Do you understand me?" Lorenzo swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. "Yes, boss, I understand. Get out, assemble the capos. We strike Volkov's counting house in Little Odessa tonight." Lorenzo nodded, straightening his suit, and practically ran for the elevator. Enzo followed silently, leaving Dominic and Juliet alone in the massive, echoing space. Dominic stood by the island, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the marble edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes, fighting to lock away the feral, violent part of himself. When he finally opened them and looked at Juliet, the anger vanished, replaced by a profound, agonizing exhaustion. Juliet stood up, her bare feet, silent on the cold floors. She walked toward him, fear warring with a strange, undeniable pull. She had seen him order deaths. She had seen the blood on his hands. By all logic, she should be terrified. Yet when he looked at her, she saw the broken, bleeding, 25-year-old boy in the alleyway. "You're bleeding," she said softly, reaching out to gently trace the split skin over his knuckles. Dominic flinched, not from pain, but from the gentleness of her touch. He looked down at her small, pale hands, resting over his bruised ones. "It's not my blood," he confessed, his voice thick with shame. "I don't want you to see this side of me, Juliet. I want to keep the ugliness away from you. You can't shield me from a war that started because of me," she replied, looking up into his icy blue eyes. "You're burning the city down. I would burn the world to ashes if it meant keeping you warm," Dominic vowed, stepping closer. He raised a hand, his bloody knuckles hovering near her face, before he carefully used the back of his clean wrist to tuck a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Volkov doesn't care about the truth anymore. He wants my head, but as long as I have breath in my lungs, you are untouchable." He leaned in his forehead, resting gently against hers. It was an incredibly intimate, vulnerable gesture from a man who ruled by fear. For the first time, Juliet didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of smoke and cedar, realizing with a terrifying certainty that she was falling in love with the ghost of New York. The next morning, Dominic left the penthouse before sunrise. The sit-down with the remaining crime families was scheduled for noon, a highly volatile meeting to negotiate a ceasefire before the streets ran red with blood. He left strict orders Juliet was not to leave the fortified inner sanctum of the penthouse, and the biometric locks were sealed. Only Lorenzo and Enzo had clearance to enter. Bored and restless, Juliet retreated to Dominic's private study. It was a massive room, lined with mahogany bookshelves and dominated by a heavy antique oak desk. Dominic had given her permission to read anything she liked, a rare concession of trust. Juliet was an art conservator. Her entire career was built on seeing what others missed, the subtle brush strokes of a forgery, the hidden layers beneath a canvas, the microscopic discrepancies in pigment. Her brain was uniquely wired to detect anomalies. As she browsed the shelves, a beautifully bound leather ledger caught her eye. It was out of place, wedged between two large volumes of Roman history. Curious Juliet pulled it out. It wasn't a book. It was a physical accounting log, handwritten. She opened it to the most recent pages, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers and dates. It was written in Italian, but the figures were universal. Shipments, payoffs, safe house locations. As she flipped through, she noticed a piece of folded parchment tucked into the binding. She pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a printed dossier. The title read, Volkov Target Profile Katerina. Below it was a photograph. Juliet stared at it, her blood turning to ice. The girl in the photograph looked nothing like her. Katerina Volkov was blonde, at least 4 inches taller, and had a distinct jagged scar above her left eyebrow. Attached to the photo was a typed schedule detailing Katerina's movements, but someone had taken a thick black pen and violently crossed out Katerina's details, replacing them with a handwritten note, target changed, 72nd Street. Tuesday night, Sotheby's employee, Juliet Hayes. Juliet's breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to shake violently. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. It had never been a mistake. Victor and Tommy hadn't grabbed the wrong girl in the dark. They had been explicitly directed to kidnap her. But why? Why would a mafia crew target a random art restorer? Juliet looked closer at the handwritten note. As a conservator, she spent hours analyzing handwriting and signatures on historical documents. The slant of the T, the aggressive cross of the H, she had seen this handwriting just yesterday. She had watched Lorenzo draft a list of compromised safe houses on a legal pad in the kitchen. Lorenzo, Dominic's trusted underboss. The pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. Lorenzo wanted Dominic dead. What better way to achieve it than to feed false intel to their own men, making them kidnap an innocent woman and frame it as an attack on the Volkov family? Lorenzo knew Dominic would execute the men who botched the job, which he did. He knew it would trigger an uncontrollable war with the Russians. With Dominic distracted by the Bratva, Lorenzo could stage a coup and take over the Castiglione Empire. You shouldn't be snooping, Juliet. The voice sliced through the silence of the study like a razor blade. Juliet spun around, dropping the dossier onto the mahogany desk. Lorenzo was standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a sharp silver suit, a suppressed pistol casually resting in his right hand. The slick, charming underboss from yesterday was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating predator. How did you get in? Juliet gasped, backing away from the desk until her spine hit the bookshelves. The locks. I am the underboss. Lorenzo smiled, a thin, cruel expression. I helped install the security system. Dominic is too blinded by his obsession with you to realize his own house is compromised. He stepped into the room, his dark eyes falling on the open dossier on the desk. He let out a low, patronizing chuckle. I see you found my private files. I underestimated you. I thought you were just a pretty little civilian he dragged out of the gutters. But you've got sharp eyes. You set him up, Juliet said, her voice remarkably steady, despite the terror gripping her heart. You orchestrated the kidnapping. You wanted Victor and Tommy to grab me, knowing it would start a war with Volkov. Victor was an idiot, Lorenzo sneered, pacing slowly toward her. I told him to grab the girl on 72nd Street. I fed him Katerina's name just to give him a motive. The plan was simple: you get kidnapped. Volkov gets the blame, and in the chaos, Dominic gets a bullet in the back during a street war. But then, the great ghost of New York recognized you. The little nurse from the alley. Lorenzo raised the suppressed pistol, pointing it directly at Juliet's chest. It actually worked out better this way. Lorenzo continued, his finger tightening slightly on the trigger. Dominic is at the sit-down right now. He thinks he's negotiating with the 5 families. But he's actually walking into an ambush. Volkov's men are waiting for him. And while he dies in a warehouse in Queens, I'm here tying up the loose ends. When the police find your body, it will just look like the Russians breached the penthouse to take back their hostage. Juliet's mind raced. Dominic was walking into a trap. The man who had moved heaven and earth to protect her was about to be slaughtered because he trusted the man standing in front of her. She looked around the study. There were no weapons, no alarms she could reach. She was trapped. He'll know, Juliet said, lifting her chin, refusing to give Lorenzo the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Dominic will survive, and when he finds out what you did, he won't just kill you. He will erase you from existence." Lorenzo laughed loudly, the sound echoing off the mahogany walls. "Brave words for a dead girl." He raised the gun to her head. "Goodbye, Juliet." Smash. The heavy glass of the study window violently shattered behind Lorenzo. Before the underboss could pull the trigger, a massive, heavy object hurled through the broken pane, striking Lorenzo squarely in the shoulder. The force spun him around his gun, firing wildly into the ceiling. With a muffled phut, Juliet screamed and dropped to the floor, covering her head as glass rained down across the Persian rug. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. The study doors were violently kicked open, splintering off their hinges. Dominic Castiglione stood in the doorway, a customized assault rifle raised to his shoulder. His suit was torn, his face smeared with soot and fresh blood, and his eyes burned with a demonic, unhinged fury that made the slaughterhouse pale in comparison. He hadn't gone to the sit-down. He had figured it out. "Lorenzo!" Dominic roared, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Lorenzo scrambled to raise his pistol, but he was too late. The ghost of New York had returned. Lorenzo's face drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. The slick, arrogant underboss who had just been gloating about his brilliant coup was suddenly staring down the barrel of an absolute nightmare. Dominic Castiglione did not look like a businessman anymore. He looked like the Grim Reaper in a ruined Brioni suit. Blood from a graze on his cheek mixed with the soot on his face, but his icy blue eyes were hyper-focused, burning with a lethal, catastrophic rage. "Boss, wait," Lorenzo stammered, dropping his suppressed pistol as if it were red-hot iron. He raised his hands, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "It was a setup. The Russians breached the perimeter. I was trying to protect her." Dominic didn't say a word. He didn't scream. He didn't argue. He simply raised the customized assault rifle, aimed low, and squeezed the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot in the enclosed study was terrifying. Juliet clamped her hands over her ears, screaming as the sound bounced off the mahogany walls. Lorenzo's right kneecap exploded into a mist of crimson. The underboss collapsed onto the shattered glass, howling in absolute agony, clutching his ruined leg. Dominic stepped into the room, his heavy combat boots crunching over the broken glass of the Persian rug. He tossed the rifle aside. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He drew his sleek, black 9mm handgun from his shoulder holster, his movements methodical and terrifyingly calm. "You thought I was blind, Lorenzo." Dominic's voice was a low, vibrating growl, a sound completely devoid of humanity. He stepped over Lorenzo's writhing body. "You sent me to a warehouse in Queens telling me Volkov's men wanted a parley. But the men waiting there weren't Russian bratva. They were Chechen mercenaries, amateurs, and they made a fatal mistake before I killed them." Lorenzo gasped, choking on his own blood, and spit his eyes wide with terror. "Please, Dominic, we're blood." "They confessed." Dominic continued, smoothly leveling the 9mm at Lorenzo's chest. "They told me they were hired by an Italian with a silver suit and a Cayman Islands account. My accountants flagged your offshore wire transfer 10 minutes before I kicked the warehouse doors in. You paid them to slaughter me so you could sit on my throne." Dominic's gaze shifted from the bleeding traitor on the floor to the desk. He saw the open dossier. He saw Katerina Volkov's crossed-out photo and the handwritten note targeting Juliet. The temperature in the room plummeted. The cold, calculating mafia boss vanished once again, replaced by the man who had loved a ghost for 5 years. "You orchestrated the kidnapping," Dominic whispered, the realization hitting him. He looked at Juliet, huddled on the floor, trembling. Then he looked back at Lorenzo. You made my men drag her into the dark. You put her in that slaughterhouse. And just now, you aimed a gun at her head. Dominic, I swear to God. Bang! A second shot rang out. Lorenzo's body jerked violently, and then he lay entirely still, his lifeless eyes staring up at the ornate ceiling. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant wail of police sirens far below on the Manhattan streets and Juliet's ragged, sobbing breaths. Dominic instantly holstered his weapon. The monster evaporated. He dropped to his knees, right in the middle of the shattered glass, uncaring as the jagged shards sliced into his tailored trousers and cut his knees. He crawled to Juliet, pulling her trembling body into his chest. Juliet, look at me. He begged, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate emotion. His hand, still stained with blood and gunpowder, cupped her face, his thumbs frantically wiping away her tears. Did he hurt you? Tell me he didn't touch you. He didn't, Juliet sobbed, burying her face into his chest, clutching the ruined fabric of his shirt. The smell of cordite and smoke was overpowering, but beneath it all, he was just Dominic. The man who had torn through an ambush and rushed across the city solely to save her. I'm okay. I'm okay. Dominic crushed her against him, burying his face in her dark hair, his massive shoulders shaking. I'm so sorry, he whispered fiercely against her temple. I was a fool. I brought the danger right to your door. I swear on my life, Juliet, it's over. The threat is gone. 3 days later, the war that had threatened to consume New York City was extinguished before it could truly begin. With Lorenzo dead, Dominic moved with surgical precision. He arranged a highly classified face-to-face sit-down with Alexei Volkov at a neutral location in Brooklyn. He brought no weapons. Instead, he brought Lorenzo's severed thumb in a cooler to bypass the biometric locks on the underboss's private laptop, and handed Volkov the decrypted files. The evidence was undeniable. Volkov saw the forged orders, the offshore bank transfers, and Lorenzo's plot to pit the Castiglione and Volkov families against each other. Satisfied that his daughter Katerina was never the actual target, the Russian kingpin agreed to a ceasefire. The blood debt was settled. That evening, Juliet stood in the center of Dominic's penthouse living room. The shattered glass in the study had been replaced, the blood scrubbed from the floors, and the gilded cage was finally open. Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker to life. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater and dark jeans, looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. On the kitchen island sat a black duffel bag and a thick manila envelope. There's $2 million in untraceable bearer bonds in that envelope, Dominic said quietly, not turning around to face her. Along with a new passport, a new social security number, and the deed to a villa in Florence. It's completely secure. Volkov doesn't care about you, and my family knows you are untouchable. You can walk out those doors right now, get on my private jet, and go back to a quiet, safe life. You can restore your paintings in Italy, Juliet. You never have to look over your shoulder, and you never have to see me again. Juliet stared at the envelope. It was everything she had wanted 3 days ago. An out. A return to the light. She slowly walked across the imported marble floor, the silence of the penthouse amplifying the sound of her bare feet. She stopped right behind him. You're an art conservator, Dominic whispered, his voice thick with a sorrow he couldn't hide. You fix beautiful things. You restore them to what they were meant to be. But I am not a painting, Juliet. I am a monster. I live in the dark, and I am drenched in blood. If you stay with me, this world will eventually stain you. I love you far too much to watch that happen. Juliet reached out gently, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against the broad expanse of his back. She felt him stiffen his breath, catching in his throat at the contact. "I spend my life fixing broken things," Juliet said softly, her voice steady and resolute. "But some things aren't meant to be fixed, Dominic. Some things are meant to be accepted exactly as they are. The shadows, the cracks, the history, it's all part of the canvas." Dominic turned around, looking down at her, with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming hope. His icy blue eyes searched her green ones, looking for any trace of fear. He found none. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Once you make this choice, Piccola, I am never letting you go. You will be mine until my dying breath." Juliet reached up her small, delicate hands, resting against his sharp jawline. She traced the faint scar on his cheek, a physical reminder of the violent world he ruled. "I saved your life in an alley 5 years ago." Juliet smiled, rising onto her tiptoes. "I think that makes your life mine, Ghost, and I have no intention of giving it back." Dominic let out a ragged breath, a sound that held 5 years of longing and a lifetime of devotion. He pulled her flush against him, his lips crashing down onto hers in a bruising, desperate kiss. It was a promise sealed in the sky, above Manhattan, a promise of protection, of absolute loyalty, and of a love forged in the darkest fires of the city. The kidnapped girl hadn't just survived the mafia boss. She had conquered him entirely. And that is the breathless conclusion of the Ghost of New York and his fearless conservator. Juliet didn't just survive the darkest underbelly of the mafia. She tamed its most ruthless kingpin, turning a tragic kidnapping into an unforgettable tale of fierce, unyielding love. If Dominic and Juliet's gripping romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this incredible true-to-life drama with your friends. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next heart-stopping Mafia Romance video.